Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We have full 2024 UFA roster availability starting this week. We can really hit the ground running now as we're just over 5 weeks away from the start of the 2024 regular season. We have so much to talk about on this episode. Team USA rosters were just announced a couple hours ago. There is a whirlwind of information to plow through with all of the players now in their official slots in lineups. There is last season's MVP still waiting to be signed. We've got so much to talk about in this episode. Let's start at the very top, talking about kind of the bigger international news. I just talked about a moment ago. Team USA UWC announcers World Ultimate Championships have been announced for 2024, and 16 UFA players will be participating. Those 16 players are Antoine Davis, Thomas Edmonds, Quinn Finer, Ben Yacht, Anders Jungs, Eli Kearns, Johnny Malks, Rowan McDonald, AJ Merriman, Jonathan Nethercutt, Saul Yannick, Marquez Brownlee, Dylan DeClerc, Khalif El Salam, Brett Holzmeyer, Jasper Tom, and John Randolph. Obviously, that was in just sort of a random order. And if you want to look through the full team announcements, you should on the USA Ultimate website. But we wanted to start off just kind of giving a congratulations to those 16 players, as that is one of the highest honors in the sport, is being selected to those teams. There is an open mixed and a women's division of those rosters. They will be playing August 31st through September 7th. So just after the conclusion of the UFA season. Cam and I were talking before this episode recorded about whether that might bump into a little bit of championship weekend festivities, which will be taking place the weekend prior to the start of Worlds. So if a team were to make it to championship weekend, would those players have to leave early? Would they stay through their team's fulfillment of the season? Still waiting to be seen. Obviously, a lot of championship rosters will, or I should say potential championship rosters will be impacted with the names on that list. There are some omissions from rosters this season, ostensibly because of the Team USA formations. Of course, talking about possibly Christian Boxley and Mac Hecht, both of whom made Team USA rosters, both of whom were also all UFA nominees last year, but not on their respective DC and Oakland rosters as of now. Cam, I've been talking way too much to start off this episode. I want to get to you. We've been kind of sitting on a lot of this information for several weeks. This is finally the opening of Pandora's box. Who are your winners heading into 2024? Obviously, the Indy AlleyCats, I think, are somebody you can talk about as having a successful offseason. But who else are you looking to around the league with all of this info now available of setting themselves up for either a good season, and then we'll talk about who might have some question marks after we get through your winners?
Sure. I'm just kind of disappointed I didn't get an invite to the World's team. I mean, I didn't apply or try out, but I felt like I still might have gotten a shot. Yeah, so there has been a lot of movement, re-signings, people moving to new teams, some people moving back to a team they played with previously, and it's kind of all been coming out pretty much over the last week or two. I gotta say, as I was putting together kind of our document that we were sharing and just kind of looking at like, okay, who had players move to them from a different team, who had re-signed players, I realized I kept writing down Chicago. Like, seemed like they were very busy in attracting new talent as well as, getting a guy like Jeff Weiss re-signed. So it was really kind of cool to put all this actually on a sheet because I had a sense of what was happening, but until I actually was looking at it all in front of me and could actually see what the full picture kind of looked like, I didn't really realize how much some teams had lost and how much other teams have gained. I will say, DC, we have talked in the past about how they have so much talent top to bottom of their roster and how maybe that, overwhelming amount of talent that they have kind of maybe led to some decision making with offense and not really having a consistent, seven that seems to be out there week in and week out. With the absence of a couple of those guys that were playing a lot of those points last year, and Ben Ort and Christian Boxley, with their names not being on the roster, maybe that kind of forces their hand into picking 7 players. And, Thomas Edmonds fan club founder right here looks like maybe he'll be getting some, maybe that's the play. I think DC is a little bit of on the losing side, though I do think they will still be very good. I think as far as winners, you got to go Chicago. Obviously, adding Joe White, adding John Lithio, Jake Rubin Miller, signing Jeff Weiss. Those are all going to be impact players for them. Oakland, I am pretty excited to see with Brunner going back there. He was a great player on the D-line before he came to Chicago. Seattle, I think we've talked about. I think they're a winner. And Carolina. Carolina also big winner with some returning some players who are coming back and adding a couple of new guys as well. So how about you? What any other winners I missed that you feel like are coming out on top during this early season? I mean, we're still 6 weeks away from opening poll.
Yeah,
but
no, it's 38 days, I believe, until April 26th, so we still got some time.
Okay.
But no, you hit on most of them. I think Chicago, obviously, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, Lithio and Weiss coming to the team, and then the announcement today or I should say yesterday, with the full roster unveiling of Joe White returning to the team. He's been one of the most talented offensive players in the sport the past couple of seasons. Obviously, he's only made 10 starts for Chicago and Carolina over the past 2 seasons. But when he's available, there's no question about the kind of ceiling he can reach. I mean, we saw that midway through last regular season when Carolina went to DC and beat them straight up behind a 13-score, damn near 800 total yard performance from Joe White Hot, as Daniel and I were calling him last summer, where it's just, there are so few players in this sport who can take over in the way that a Joe White can. And so when you add him into a roster that I think already had a lot of nice pieces, a lot of stabilizer players, I would say, to give them a sort of stallion in White who can come in and just kind of blow the roof off of an opponent. And also knowing that he's going to have Jeff Weiss around and John Lithio also as big, able-bodied playmakers. Like, it's just, I think with Chicago, you get this new volatility, right? Like, there are now increased expectations after last year's rebuilding campaign. But with that, I think there is more opportunity. I feel like last year it was so much in the shadow of, we've moved on from Pavlianis. We're experiencing all of these departures. It's clearly going to be an entirely new era. And now we're kind of in that era. And now it's sort of like, all right, who can kind of run the show? Who can kind of take over and make this team their identity? And last year we saw, I think, a lot of good efforts. You know, Ben Prius, Jason Steslicki in their first seasons in Chicago had, I think, really solid years. You talk about Sam Kaminsky, Jack Shanahan, sort of some of the veteran players. They also had stable years. Andrew Sjogren in his first season, of course, is going to put up goals and receiving yardage wherever he goes. He's just Mr. Consistent. The tax man, I think, is what Ross Barker used to refer to him, because he just collects on time. They had all of these nice pieces, but you could see even against you guys in Indy, there was no extra gear. It was sort of like a fixie bike or something. It can get you from A to B, but as far as doing something more, there wasn't really much there. With Weiss, Lithio, and White, there's a lot more there. And I think that really transformed Chicago. You mentioned Colorado, too. They re-signed basically everyone that they need to, aside from obviously the retirement of Cody Spicer, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. They also add in, I think, some really nice need fit pieces. You talk about Chance Cochran, a former U24 Team USA gold medalist and kind of do everything player. He kind of figures to be another defensive starting piece that they can utilize. Logan Pruis, coming over from the Madison Radicals, has played almost 800 points of defense in this league. Many year veteran, 2018 champion. He just gives them, again, another utility piece, super strong, stable part of that deep now Summit D-line rotation. And then my kind of favorite ad that they got, Jeremy Knopf from DC Breeze. They also added Cody Johnston, who hasn't played in this league since 2019. I kind of want to see how he comes back before I talk too much more about him. But Knopf has been this just almost errorless pivot handler that DC has used in spot starts. And whenever they
Mhm.
allow him the opportunity to sort of fill in a role, he's handled it. And for Colorado, I think in particular, they need a cleaner fish like Knopf. They need somebody who just goes out there, kind of gets the breakthrow or the continuation, the little tweener thing that sets somebody else up into power position, that gets the disc to Feiner or Atkins or Nethercutt in a more favorable spot that they didn't seem to have last year. I think Sam Goldstein did really, really well when they gave him opportunity. Danny Landisman, obviously, when healthy, is a stud. But Colorado was kind of feast or famine with the Huck, and that really showed up in their inconsistencies in offense. So I love Colorado there. Seattle, we've touched on Lucas Ambrose signing, but then again, they bring in Christian Foster, who hasn't played in this league except for a couple of starts back in 2017 with the Montreal Royale. Completely forgot about that. So he's making his second pro stint, but he's been a legendary puller in the sport for almost 2 decades now. I was talking with one of the members of the Cascades, and they say the new pulling rules plus Foster's ability as a puller is just quote unquote insane. So really interested to see if they can kind of weaponize CFO pulls with Ambrose's blocking ability and turn that Cascades defense up a notch. Carolina looks, I think, in a much better spot than last year. I think the talent is about the same, but they bring back some team vets in Henry Fisher and Alan Laviolette. Alan Laviolette, the last time he played in 2021 when the team won a championship, made an all-UFA roster. He missed the entire 2022 season with an injury and then didn't play in 2023. But when he's healthy and in rhythm, he's one of the most versatile hybrid players in an offense you can have. And I think especially with Junks being selected to Team USA, having Laviolette around to maybe fill in if Junks is gone on practices can be really, really instrumental for the Flyers. You guys in Indianapolis, I really like what you guys have done. Kind of re-signed everybody. We can even break some news here on this show. He wasn't a part of the formal roster announcement, but Keegan North is coming back for the AlleyCats. Very exciting news for you guys. Big Keegan North fan. He's been an X factor for your offense ever since he slotted in with you guys. And I think 2018 was his first year. And
Yes.
your offense has looked completely different. Talk about a player that kind of adds another gear or pushes your ceiling higher. He's just always kind of been available for you guys as a playmaker. Having him there now, along with the new additions of Jake Kenev and Jack Havey, who you're all still trying to figure out rotation time and playing spots for. But problem of many might be a little good for you guys. Just a lot of options to choose from on offense. And then the other team that I just wanted to mention was Oakland. I know that they're going to be losing Mac Heck this year, it seems like, which is just a huge blow. He was their QB1 last year, and it really felt like the anchor point that allowed them to kind of exceed a lot of expectations. He won't be back, but they're bringing in a host of revolver guys. They're bringing in Justin Lim, Itay Chang. There's some rumors that Eli Kearns, who I just mentioned, he's listed on the roster, not quite signed yet. Jason Valley, too, from the Los Angeles Aviators and Chicago Union, a really great defender. He might be on there. They did sign Jace Brunner from Chicago. He has 29 blocks over the last 2 seasons for the Union. Just that, they lose Hecht, but it almost feels like a little bit of moneyballing going out in the Bay where they might be able to get some return in the aggregate. Not always a huge fan of that. You can't just replace a Hecht 1-to-1, but they've got some nice pieces. Of these 6 teams, not talking about yourself, who do you think improved their stock the most? I know that's not fair when I make Indy exclusionary, but
Yeah. Well, and it's really hard to say, right? Because do you look at it from did you go from let's take Seattle. For Seattle, they might improve the most when it comes to record or placement within their division. But the way I kind of want to tackle this actually is where is your end of season expectations based off of the things you've done and who pushed themselves maybe into real championship contention? Because as you mentioned briefly earlier, and I know we'll talk about more, the fact that Jeff Babbitt has not been signed yet, and not
burying
just
the
Jeff Babbitt,
lead.
but also I know also Ben Katz, I know that doesn't get quite the same. That's not quite the same name recognition, but like I also think there has been so many times where we've seen highlights or we've even heard announcers during a game talk about some play that Ben Katz made with his, you know, galaxy brain up here, that he just kind of see things unfolding before anyone else does, and he just ends up in the right place in the right time, and he does that as well as anyone. So you kind of put those in there. I think I'm going to go with Colorado. I do like the fact that they return so many of their key pieces. Like you said, they re-signed essentially everyone except for Cody Spicer that you would really be hoping for them to re-sign. Adding a couple of more pieces in there. You mentioned Logan Pruitt. Played against that guy for years. Like he is a quality player that he can add out there. Lots of experience. Has played in a lot of big games. I know Madison hasn't been playing in as many big games recently, but he is someone left over from that time when they were playing a lot of really big important games. So I like that. I think it just makes them more competitive within their own division. Obviously, Salt Lake was kind of they're the reigning kings of that division, and they were clearly the best team in that division last year. I think I like where Colorado's heading this year. I am going to, really, I'm going to slightly favor them in that division. I know that's not going to be the popular pick and as good as Salt Lake looked last year, but I think we know that Colorado has the talent to compete. And I think the additions you talked about already, kind of in a little more depth, I think adding those pieces in, I think if they use them correctly,
I trust them to use
and
them
kind of,
correctly. Mikey Loon and TK, that coaching staff in Colorado is very legit. They are very,
yeah.
Planning focused.
And they're all in on it too, which is
Yeah.
the other thing. Like they're committed. Like that, one thing being still sort of a fledgling league. Like so many teams have coaches come and go, and they've had they've looked really steady there in their first 3 years, and I think that's really important to building a culture and to like building systems, building trust between players and coaching staff too. Having so many of those high level players who have been there all 3 years now. Quinn Finer, a guy who made a Team USA team, clearly a very talented player, a guy I picked last week as one of my favorites to win it, one of my favorites for non-Empire players to potentially win the MVP award. So they clearly have the talent, they have the coaching, and I think just adding a couple more pieces in, and if they, the injury bug has bitten them over the last couple seasons, like that's kind of like this X factor, right? But all things considered, on paper right now, if it's your best 20 versus our best 20 type of situation, I really like what Colorado's bringing to the table.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that Colorado just need to do over the offseason was get healthy. I'm writing an article right now about how they had half a dozen of their defensive starters miss multiple games last year. I mean, Saeed Semrin looked like he was maybe going to lead the league in blocks and then had to miss a month of play. You talk about Matthew Agee and Alex Tatum missing times. They looked like two of the most explosive players in the league on defense in 2022. I mean, they were absolutely a part of what made the Summit so athletically imposing in the first season in the league. And Colorado didn't have that edge last year. It was just visible. I mean, you look at how LA just sort of held them out in the second half of that playoff win in Colorado. And it was honestly, we've talked about it a couple times. Like it was a little shocking given the level of talent and sort of the expectations that we have for that Summit roster. And so I think them just getting a little bit more healthy, and I think having a few more pieces to tinker with and experiment with is going to be great for this particular coaching staff. I think, again, we've talked about DC, the problem of many, what happens when you just have too many players and too few spots available on these 7-person rotations. But with Colorado, I kind of like it, especially when they're going to be dealing with Nethercutt and Finer having Team USA responsibilities. Having these extra pieces to sort of fill in stopgaps is going to be really, really valuable. I realize as we kind of bring in Salt Lake a little bit, I would kind of almost like to add them now to one of the successes for the offseason. I know that they didn't really add anybody of note, but the fact that they were able to keep together like 95% of last year's championship appearance team bring back Grant Lindsley for a year or two, who was only improving towards the end of last season. Yeah, you've got your 2019 Grant Lindsley undefeated Empire jersey on there. If you're listening at home, Cam is showing it off on the webcam.
My Superman jersey.
You know, I think Salt Lake kind of deserves to be shoehorned into this winners of the offseason lift, just because going into last year, they experienced actually a ton of departures. They almost lost their entire defensive line going into 2023. Obviously, that was a huge part of what made their success so thrilling, I think, was this sort of interchanging of new pieces and reaching that new level. And obviously, a huge reason why Bryce Merrill was honored with the Coach of the Year last year. And it just sort of figures if he's got the same pieces now to develop, in his own words, as they kind of did last year, everyone just sort of improved 10 to 15%. They even get an amount of that again this year. I mean, we'll talk about it later in the episode, but with some of the omissions on New York's roster, with just sort of the little bit of chaotic feeling heading into 2024, I really like the stability of last year's runner-up finishers. I really like the fact that they're just saying, run it back. We get to play at home this year if we make it to championship weekend. And we really like our odds. We've got a revenge matchup with the Empire in New York. We're circling that with like 5 different kinds of permanent marker on our calendars. Like, this team is motivated. They are restocked. They are stable. I'm adding the shred to my winners list. I'm putting them on there. They're team number 7. We've got like a 4th of the league in our winners list. I don't know if that works on any kind of grading curve. You can let me know there, Mr. Teacher. But
I feel like, I mean, simple math. I mean, obviously this isn't 100% foolproof, but you would think that like with roster movement or keeping rosters the same in general, you probably have about half the teams winning and half the teams losing, whether they're losing by a lot or just barely getting a little bit worse or barely getting a little bit better. I think the big thing with the shred too is, for me, I had 2 question marks going into the offseason, really, and my 2 question marks were Elijah Jaime and Grant Lindsley. Were they going to come back? These aren't native Utahns. I don't know how you say it. They're not native to Utah, although I think you did mention that Grant Lindsley did move out to Utah.
I think that's the case, yeah.
You believe so? So, but like for Elijah Jaime, like, guy who was playing in Atlanta and I believe flying out to games and stuff, like he obviously was a pretty critical part to their offense. I think it's sometimes easy to forget him because you get so locked in on Jordan Kerr and Grant Lindsley and Jace Dunabile scoring a million goals and Jacob Miller seemingly being perfect from the backfield, that you kind of forget that Elijah Jaime is like an incredible receiver.
Perennial 40-goal scorer. Led Atlanta 3 straight years in scoring. Like, is exactly. Just one of those. It's no coincidence that he was the one to catch the Joel Clutton Mac in the semifinal game. Like, if you had to straw poll the dude who's going to be in the right place, right time, it's Elijah Jaime.
Yeah, and we got to experience multiple times just how good that guy is. And it was when they re-signed, when we knew that they were coming back, like, yeah, they weren't adding anyone new necessarily, but when we talked about many weeks ago now, what does it take to be a successful franchise? You want to have players right now that can make you better. You want to have young players who can contribute and continue to develop so that they can become those future playmakers that maybe at some point do become your go-tos. And you kind of want to mix, right? Like, you don't want all youth. You don't want all experience. You want this healthy mix. And Salt Lake already had that. They have a lot of local talent that's spanning in different ages, most of them still pretty young and definitely not even close to their primes yet, including Jordan Kerr, who's just going to, I think, keep getting better. And then you do have a Grant Lindsley, who's, a little more seasoned, has all of the experience in the world from winning a championship in this league to playing in Worlds games and winning championships there. Oh, yeah, he's won 2 championships. I forgot. He's another
he just collects
journeyman.
Medals and trophies like the rest of us do Lint. I mean, I think he's got like 2 trophies in every single division he's played in, including like Worlds competitions. I'm not even joking in that way.
And he's just like he's played with what, 4 or 5 UFA teams. He played in Minnesota, played in New York, Salt Lake, and San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he's kind of been all over the place. Reminds me of Brett Matzuka. He was an AlleyCat for a couple of years, and he's another guy who's kind of played all over the place. And he in the middle of our last season that he played with us, he comes back and he meets us in Chicago for our game, and like, oh, he had just won Masters Worlds with Boneyard, and I'm like, man, how was it? How was winning Worlds? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and he goes, it was all right, I guess. He's like, after you win 7 of these, it starts to lose its luster. I was like, that is the most
Yeah,
insane
but that's not
sentence I've
Grant.
ever heard before.
Like that's Brett Matsuka. I didn't see that from Grant last year. I saw Grant
No,
actually
no, no.
really appreciating being kind of the champion shepherd for a Salt Lake team that otherwise had like no championship experience in almost any division
for sure.
outside of Grant Lindsley.
Yeah, and he was great last year too. I think that was a question for me. Like, we know he had been coming back from the injury, and like, how would he do after kind of such a traumatic experience?
Can we just pause again? It's one of those things where I just want to pause to give the respect to that moment. I mean, that guy came back from a cataclysmic head injury not even 9 months later and started playing like we all expected him to, as smooth, swaggery, just stepping out there and making everything look easy. I'm still like, the fact that has happened and it's in the rear view now, and we're just accepting of it's year 2, Grant Lindsley in Salt Lake. Oh, hum. Like, that's crazy. And hats off to Grant and all of his support network for coming through what happened in the fall of 2022.
That was scary. And then, like you said, is like he just kind of walked back onto the field like nothing happened.
He's got the headgear. The only change is that he has a headgear instead of a headband. Like he's got the concussion new styro foam helmets that they have on now. Like, that's it. There's an aesthetic difference. That's it.
And if you're not paying that close of attention, you wouldn't even notice the difference. If you just kind of glance at him, you'd just be like, oh, he's wearing his headband. Like, it's just Grant Lindsley out there. But I think you're right. Like, they didn't make any big splashy move, because they made the splashy moves last year when they brought in Elijah Jaime and Grant Lindsley, and when they added Joel Clutton late in the season. Like, that was their splash. And now it's like, now we're keeping the band together, because this band was pretty dang good, so we don't really need to like be tweaking too much. And in a lot of cases, year 2, having most of the same players again, like, that's where you really start to hit your stride. So like, I almost feel like I'm talking myself out of the Colorado pick now, right? Like, but like, that's the thing, when you can keep like the band together for a second year, and as long as everyone's bought in, the thing you have to worry about a little bit is like, how hard did they take the loss to New York last year? The fact that they lost them twice, and the fact that in the championship game, it was just really never close. Like, it felt like New York had that game won in the first quarter. Like, you could just tell it was just, and it felt that way for New York in their semifinal game against Austin as well. It didn't take long to realize, oh yeah, this is the team that just hasn't lost in forever. Like, we see why now. So as long as everyone is just like bought into the idea of like, we can improve and we can get better, it's hard to imagine, and especially with the absences on the roster right now, with New York, with the age of their players, like, do they really get better at this point, or are
you've been taking the wrapping off of this present of trying to bury the lead about the New York roster situation as well as the mission. So let's just get into it. We're throwing the winners to the side. This is the present under the tree that Cam has been wanting to talk about for the past 2 days, and I've been trying to tamp down a little bit. Daniel Cohen mentioned it in his article online on WatchUFA.com. Evan mentioned it. Lepler mentioned it as well in his Tuesday toss. Both of those out now. You should go read them on the website if you haven't. Great coverage. What maybe the biggest story of this offseason, and maybe the biggest story now heading towards 2024, is of course what I led this episode with, and what Cam keeps bringing up now in bits and spurts, is the 2023 league MVP Jeff Babbitt is not currently on the roster of the New York Empire. That is because of contract negotiations, or so I'm being told. So I don't know the particulars of that. We're going to kind of leave that all up in the air, but the last season's MVP being up in the air is a story unto itself. And along with that, there are also a couple other teams, and we'll get to them in due time, who are just experiencing some omissions that leave a lot of questions as to what's going to happen to them going into the season. DC being one of those teams, LA as well,
Yes.
Minnesota too. It's not to say that they're necessarily going to be worse. And again, Jeff Babbitt still might end up signing with New York. He's just not currently on the roster. But this is a massive change, a seismic shift, if you will, in the landscape. And I think the understanding of what we have of these teams going into 2024. I mean, the whole thing of New York has been not just the star talent, but the impenetrability of it. The fact that you'd have to go through, okay, Ben Yard isn't having a great game. Okay, Jack Williams isn't having a great game. We got a mediocre game from Ryan Osgar, but oh no, here comes Jeff Babbitt or whoever, like it's the way in which you knock one down and another one comes up and takes his place like it's the head of a hydra or something. And with now the loss of one of their head coaches and Charlie Hoppus having to step away for health reasons this year, with John Lithgow going to Chicago, with Jeff Babbitt not currently on the roster, also Ben Katz not currently on the roster, as you alluded to, one of the best defensive players and one of the block geniuses in this league. No, I don't use that word lightly, but seriously, block geniuses. Go look at Ben Katz's highlights. He does have like a preternatural ability to read the disc in situations. Without those two players, with a host of other players, including Ben Yot, Antoine Davis, Marquez Brownlee, and John Randolph with Team USA commitments, is this finally, mercifully for the rest of the league, the moment in which we can start asking, is the end of the empire in sight? Is this 30-game winning streak really in jeopardy now? Is this a team that's mortal, for the love of God? This team has run off the best competition in the league the last two championship weekends. 4 straight games in the semifinals and championship where they just ran people off the field by the end of it. Wasn't even close in the fourth quarter or any of those games.
No.
This feels like enough. This feels like enough to start getting in there. It does.
Well, and I think the thing we talked about pre-show, right, was the way they've been constructed over the past few seasons. You had Ben Yot or Jeff Babbitt playing D-line, right? You had an MVP playing D-line. And, a championship weekend last year, it was Babbitt on the D-line after Ben Yot had spelled for him in the East Division championship game and, put up what appeared to be the types of numbers that I put up when I go play in my local rec league. Like that's kind of what it looked like. And that's where they become, as you said, like they become mortal, because you no longer have the option, if you're New York, to put Ben Yot. Hey, we're just going to put Ben Yot on D-line and he's going to be great there and he's going to lead the counterattack and he's going to become our best puller and, he's going to be the guy who anytime a disc is in the air, he's going to come down with it. Like, and if it wasn't him, it was Jeff Babbitt back there. Like there was those two guys are maybe 1 and 2 in the league in whatever order you want to. And hey, a disc is in the air, go get it. And they are no longer going to have access to that on both lines, like throughout the entire game. So I do think this makes a huge impact, not just on the defensive side, but also on the counterattack. Like those two guys are not only the ones who are very likely to get a D, but they're very likely to be the ones punching it in for that break. You can't replace these types of athleticism and honestly, like kind of the fear that they can strike in opposing teams.
I think I'm now in 2 episodes in a row where I'm like, I'm analysis based, I like numbers, and then I get off into mysticism. But there was a mysticism about this team. I mean, you could see it against Salt Lake in that championship game. They put Jeff Babbitt on defense to start that game because he went out and intimidated people. That was a legitimate strategy that New York's coaching staff employed in the 2023 finale, was to put Jeff Babbitt on defense so that the first point of the game, Salt Lake's offense had to come out and go, oh crap, that's the MVP. And oh crap, he really knows how to play defense too. And put him on Jay Stunabile and kind of took their best receiver off to the side on their opening possession. And from there, things just kind of came apart for the Shred. But I buy into the intimidation factor for New York. I think that has been a big deal for opponents the past couple of years. I think people would shy away from maybe admitting that in certain circumstances, but I've seen it with my eyes, man. I just see the way that opponents and other teams take this New York team when they run lines at you that feature Babbitt and Yacht and Oscar and Jack Williams and just sort of put it down your throat. And they might not have that. They might have to go to a different plan. And the thing is that I still very much think they're a championship contender, right? We're talking about them becoming more,
100%.
but they still look, even with this iteration of their roster right now, it's like this is still probably a top 4 team. It's just they're down from Mount Olympus, right? Like this,
yes,
it's enough. It's enough to bring them.
They're
back
demigods now. They're not full on gods anymore. They're demigods now. Like there's a weakness there.
They bleed.
They bleed. Nobody makes me bleed my own blood. And the thing, this could be a bunch of talk for nothing, right? Maybe a couple weeks from now, they end up signing. But I think.
Oh no! Go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was just gonna say it gobsmacked me because they hadn't announced it yet. They've been announcing Jack Williams and everything else, and like what truly gobsmacked me was just thinking back to being on the sideline next to all the New York players when they were literally winning the championship and pouring Gatorade on their coaches and everything. And Babbitt was just. I was trying to describe it to somebody yesterday. He was like exultant. He was so visibly processing all of his emotions, crying, hugging everyone to death. Him and Ben Yacht were hugging for like multiple minutes in a row, just like talking to each other. And just, like taking it in. You could just like feel, even being next to the guy, that Babbitt was just there, like processing all of it. And so to be now here receiving this news, it's nuts.
Yeah.
Did not see this coming.
And it's the thing we've kind of talked about them too. It's not just the talent level they had. It's like all the buy-in that they have from everybody, and that they all show up to every practice, and like that they all show up to every game. So like that whole narrative, that whole narrative still rings true. We're still like, 5.5, 6 weeks away from opening poll. Like there's still plenty of time for things to get figured out, for if it is contract negotiations, for those negotiations to come to a point where they reach an agreement. But I mentioned something else. I kind of mentioned, like we talked about our winners. Like to me, Philadelphia and Boston maybe are winners seriously. Here because they
Philly big winners.
They both kind of return everybody. Philadelphia does lose CJ Colicchio, who did play for them last year. He played in Pittsburgh for I think 1 or 2 years in a row before that, and had played with Philly last year. Which, by the way, you want to talk about a line that has some height on it: CJ Colicchio, Greg Martin, and James Pollard. I mean, that's a lot of
Greg
height.
Martin out of there. I like Greg Martin as like an aerial person, but he is not a big man.
He's one of those players that you're right. As far as actual height,
freak beast of an athlete, but he is like 5'9", if that.
Yeah, let me rephrase that. A jump ball goes up, and those three are going for it.
Okay, fine. You just said size, and I was like, look, I know Martin makes plays like he's big, but
so outside of that, though, they're pretty much returning the roster they've had the last couple of years. A roster that a couple of years ago was really punchy, and a roster that we've seen compete with New York, compete with DC in these games. They haven't quite been able to get over the edge, right? They haven't quite been able to get to the victory, but they've been right there with those teams, with DC consistently. And with New York, it seems like once a year, they're just so close to knocking them off. Well, I mean, you talk about a team that's been right there, and we talked about Boxley and Ort being gone from DC. I don't think we've even mentioned yet Alexander Fall and Musa Jaw also gone. Like, those are huge losses for them. And I know it's we talk about scoring, right? It's like the curse of all sports. Like we talk a lot about the people who score a lot. But like, one thing that DC has also had, it hasn't just been depth on their O-line and having all these players that could seemingly fit in and slot in and be good offensive players. It's been some pretty good D-line play too. Like, they have had a slew of players that they could put out there that would start on any D-line in this league. And they've been very solid on that side of the disc as well. Losing those two.
You're missing a World's Game player, Troy Holland. Talk about underrated defensive
player.
Yeah, it's fine. I I was just a little shocked to see him make Worlds simply because I feel like people are finally catching up the past 2 years to how good that guy is, both in coverage and on a counterattack. He's one of the most like devilish push pass players. His push pass giving goes in transition. Oh, he's brutal with that stuff. But yeah, I mean, Fall, Holland, Ja, those are all top line starting defensive players on any team in this league.
It's just like, and then you look at Philly and Boston, who have kind of just returned the players that you like, pretty much everyone that you want to return. Maybe adding an extra piece here
Boston
or there,
is
like
missing
something.
Ray Tetro and Orion Cable right now from the rosters, which would be two big offensive pieces missing. But they do have still rotations on both offense and defense that go 7+ deep that I like.
And I think Orion Cable played like 5 games last year. So like, even though
for as talented as he is, I made an argument on this show that they were playing better without him. Now, a lot of things and a lot of circumstances had to contribute to that opinion, and I wouldn't necessarily say that a team is better without Orion Cable than with him on their roster. That would be insanity. But Boston was, through the chemistry that they had found in lieu of him, playing better than they had almost at any point in their offense's history over 3-ish seasons. So that was the only thing. But
100%.
Boston is,
I think both those
I just wanted to bring it up as a point of saying, like, Boston does have some pieces missing, but I generally agree with your point of they returned most of what made their roster strong last year.
Yeah, and when you're a team like Philadelphia or Boston, that, let's just be like honest, like there are pretty much no teams in the league that have have had the depth of talent of like a New York and DC. So really, for most of the rest of the teams in the league, it is about returning those top contributors. And then if you can get players to re-up and get more experience and start to build as players and improve, that's great. But, let's be real, like not all of us are swimming in the talent that DC and New York have been. So the fact that they are returning their biggest contributors for the most part, and like we talked about with Philly, like Philly is not afraid, has never been afraid of New York, has never really been afraid of the DC matchup. They kind of like relish, actually, like they play in a lot of cases their best ultimate when they're playing against their best opponents. They tend to match whoever they're playing against. Like they'll take New York to overtime and then they'll play Pittsburgh to a 1-goal game. Like those things don't really
that
seem
was in
to
back-to-back
coalesce
weeks
together. Yeah, it's just kind of like it shows you the hot birds and the cold birds, right? Mm-hmm. Like, who are we getting this week? But I like what I see from them. I'm excited with Trisellini coming back for his second year. That's going to be. I'm really excited to see if he kind of even. He was so good last year. I'm excited to see if he takes a step forward this year and maybe improves after a year of experience in the league. So another team similar to Salt Lake, where those two teams kind of like good offseason by being steady in their roster, especially in a division where the top two teams are losing some pieces. I know there was a mention in the write-up about the Bonnet, who's coming over to DC. But that'll be. I'll be interested to see what he brings to the table and how he fits into DC. I'm sure he'll be great, but that's not going to compare to the 5 players that aren't going to be there. So I'll just be curious to see how it all shakes out once we actually get to opening day. And like that first game of the year, right? DC Salt Lake, like that's kind of like, this puts a whole new spin on that game. DC's going to be rolling out some pieces.
It's sort of like this clash. It was already going to be, I think, a little bit of a clash of styles for these two teams, obviously being interdivisional foes, meeting for the first time. But now you talk about the stability that Salt Lake has on their side, coaching staff, roster, venue, all of that, playing at home, opening weekend. You've got this DC team that is undoubtedly talented. I mean, look at the World's players that they're rostering. They've got 6 of them. But new coach, new system, new rotations and spots for a lot of players. It's going to be real intriguing to see that first Super Series matchup. Of course, going to be streamed live and free on the league's YouTube channel. I want to get back to, though, a couple of the points that you had made and just go over a little bit finer comb detail. First off, with New York. I wanted to kind of relate it to a couple of other historic sports teams saddled with their own ambitions, right? Like This is a New York team that is currently riding a 30-game win streak into 2024, tied for the longest ever in league history. They've won back-to-back titles, 3 of the last 4. They have 3 perfect seasons in the last 4 seasons, all their title seasons. They have attention, whether they want to accept that or not, with the weight and the history that they are bearing now. And what you were saying before about that discipline of roster, the practices, the way that we went into the past 3 seasons knowing New York was going to be at the top. Ever since they won in 2019 and they had that perfect season that was perfect with almost an asterisk given how many close finishes that they needed to keep that record pristine. Ever since then, it's been like unquestionable what they bring into each year, right? Like it was just a given. You knew what the core was going to be. You knew they were going to be reloaded. And they were probably also, oh, by the way, going to add in a John Randolph midway through the season in 2022 or something, or Josue Aloro last year. Breton Tan was the one last year. They add in arguably a top 5 handler defender midway through the season. Like that's what New York has been doing. They're not doing that right now. They're going to be bringing in some other pieces that will be interesting, and I'm sure that they'll get really good rotation play from some of the new players that they'll bring in lieu of whatever pieces that they lost. But they're kind of like the 08 Patriots and the 2016 Warriors right now, where I worry about the records and the sort of austerity of this dynasty that they've built in the face of every single week, everyone gets to take a shot at becoming the team that breaks that, at making themselves that placeholder in history, sort of supplanting New York. And I'm just starting to have questions. I'm like giddy that I have questions about New York for the first time in several years. I like it's the stuff that makes this stuff come crumbling down, right? Like New York has been talking about it for the past year, that this team is built on a lot of hard work, but also there's some luck involved here. There's some, alchemy going on. There is a force binding us that is greater than the talents or whatever else we're putting in here. And I feel like it's waning. I feel like I can feel it a little bit. And do you think New York loses a game in the first month of the season?
Ooh, I'd have to go look at their schedule.
No, I'm asking that question in the blind myself. Here, I'll bring it up, and you can answer that question having no information.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I think if they have a game, I want to say their Atlanta game's later. Isn't it?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They have a game on May 31st. They have 6 games before June. They face Montreal twice, Atlanta, Boston, and Philly. Boston twice and
Atlanta,
Philly once. Do they lose against any of those teams?
If the roster is as it is now when those games are played, give me Philly.
You also going to take Atlanta?
Yeah.
So, like, on the record, I'm writing it down. It's going into the internet sphere. 4-2 record with the current roster by the end of May.
2 losses, yeah. 4-2. 4-2 and still in first place. How about that?
I mean, that's oh man, it could really be a bloodbath in the East. I mean, the East last year already had a pretty tense atmosphere. Montreal is going to be good again this year, I think, or not good. They have a lot to pull out from last year's winless season, but they're re-adding, I think, a lot of good pieces. They get back Quinton Bonad. The league leader in goals in 2019. He had 83 goals that season, set a per game record. They bring back a couple of other players that have played for them. Kevin Grew is another name. Jacob Brissett, who barely played last year. I think he made 1 start. Iwan Kohoner. Like, Montreal is going to be better than they were last year. They were so inconsistent in their lineups and everything. Like, East is going to be tense week to week. There aren't going to be easy games like there were last year.
Well, and it was one of the few divisions. It was really just the West and the East where we were kind of looking at playoff spots kind of almost all the way to the end of the season. Like the other, the South and the Central, we had it figured out for a while, really. Like it was pretty clear who the top 3 teams were going to be, who was going to make the playoffs. But Philly and Boston were kind of battling until like the second to last week of the season, when Boston kind of officially eliminated them from the playoffs. I do think it is going to be more tense, like you said. I'm excited to see that playoff race. Montreal obviously doesn't really have anywhere to go but up from last year. I think you're right with some additions of players back on the roster. Hopefully they're available for lots of games. They did lose Brandon Adibe, who is heading over to Toronto. We haven't talked about Toronto yet. Jeremy Hill did tear his ACL last year. It seems he is not signed back on. I would assume probably still kind of recovering from that. And adding Brandon Adibe, though, I mean, he's a very skilled player. He played with Montreal last year after playing with Ottawa before that. Toronto had a lot of young pieces. And it looks like a lot of them are back. And I think that is a team that maybe, this is probably actually, I think since I have joined the pod, really kind of the first mention of Toronto. But they are a team who could make some noise. Like, we haven't talked about them, but I think they have a legitimate chance at making the playoffs too. I would still, I think, favor Boston and Philly over them, but I would not be shocked at all if they were able to sneak into the playoffs.
I think playoffs is still a stretch. I went in super hard as Toronto kind of being my hype team last year. Obviously, the Phil Turner injury did them no favors. They were already really thin on defense, and that just kind of took their legs out and led to a lot of high-scoring games for them, which is something that their offense likes to partake in, but isn't always the best strategy for them, given their efficiency numbers.
Sure.
They like shootouts, but doesn't always suit them. I agree. I like a lot of their pieces. They're just kind of back in a position, especially with Philly and Boston, I think looking so strong, of they've got to show me that they can beat those teams consistently before I start giving them a playoff nod. But to your point, I don't think that they're going to be an easy out. I think that they have a lot of really nice young pieces. You talk about Brandon Adibe coming over, Akifumi Morioka, the Japanese player who scored a ton of points for them in 2019 in his rookie season. He's back after a couple seasons away. It'll be interesting to see how he's matured and progressed as a player. Haven't seen him, but they still have really nice pieces. I mean, Oscar Stonehouse was on the all-rookie team 2 years ago. You talk about Luke Comire and the Lewis brothers. They're some of the most productive offensive players. Phil Turner will be back healthy again this year. Again, he leads the league in blocks, it seems like, every single year when he's fully healthy and available, and is one of the few players in the league who can be a legit Ben Yacht stopper in one-on-one situations. Mm-hmm. He's got that kind of skill and size in one-on-one matchups. Yeah, I like a lot of things about the Rush. I need to see it. I really liked what they were capable of doing last year. They had a favorable schedule. They had interdivisional games against Pittsburgh and Detroit, and that was kind of all they could do. They couldn't really get purchase against any non-Montreal team in the East. So I hear you. I like what I see. I just need it to be more than paper at this point.
No, I agree. I think Phil Turner being healthy for the whole season would go a long way. I got to play with him out at All-Star Weekend, and he was almost like a hidden gem for me. Toronto wasn't much to pay attention to that year. They weren't really going anywhere, and they hadn't really had great seasons since 2017-18. They've been kind of middling or more towards the bottom of the division. But man, seeing him play in person, I mean, you could have made an argument. I know Abe Coffin was the MVP. You could have made an argument for him as being our MVP as well. He had some huge plays in that game, and I was just like, gosh, this guy is so big and so talented. And I was just like talking to him about how they were really excited for the 2023 season, they knew they were going to be adding some new players. And I was like, man, with a guy like that, I would be excited too. I hope he can stay healthy, because you're right. Like, he is a guy who he can lead the league in blocks. He's a guy who can match up with Ben Yacht, James Pollard, the likes of those monsters over there in the East. I did want to touch on some other things we haven't really talked about yet. Like, we haven't gotten too into Carolina, but bringing back, so Clint McSherry, who has been playing with Pittsburgh for the last couple of years, is going back over to Carolina, and Henry Fisher's returning. Shout out number 3. Let's go. Best number. And then Drew Swanson, who has played with Chicago, played part of a season before injuring his knee out in Seattle. This is a guy who I can't remember if he led the league in blocks in 2019, but he was near the lead in blocks that year. I want to say Kittleson maybe led the league in blocks, but Drew Swanson was right there near the top for that team. Henry Fisher and Drew Swanson, that's two tall dudes. And like, as you mentioned off air, Matt Tucker and Drew Swanson on defense, that is a ton of length and speed.
That's a goon squad right there. You're not going to like going up against both of them in the lineup. Like, they're players, they look a little goofy when they run, but their size and their disc reading ability just puts them in a position almost seemingly at will. Drew Swanson, that is another one of those signings where if DeNardis and Carolina can get a good number of starts and he comes back healthy, he is one of 6 players ever in this league's history to average over 2 blocks a game. It's just a different kind of defensive playmaking ability with him. And again, like Fisher, Swanson, Tucker, like Carolina's got some size. And I always really like teams that just sort of cultivate that. So Fairfax, like, they can kind of stand up with you. They got that the rookie last year, Xander Wilcox. I think he was out of high school last year. He figures to be improving really, really rapidly. Big guy. He was the one who chucked that crazy buzzer beater to Jacob Fairfax, a deflection in the layout in week 1 of last year. Huge arm. Like, I like Carolina a lot. Like, Carolina is one of those teams. Every single time I go back and look at like rosters, I'll be like, I'm going to move up Carolina a little bit higher in my preseason power rankings I'm forming right now. Just another little notch. Like, they've just got talent, speed, size, depth. Like, it's back to like how we were talking about Carolina before last season, where it's just like they've got an embarrassment of riches.
Maybe most importantly, if we bring the player chatter back this year, Clint McSherry will make sure that Carolina is heard and represented.
McSherry's great, man.
I don't really remember.
He's had some really impressive individual throwing game performances for the Thunderbirds over the last couple of years.
He has, but I wonder where he slots in on this Carolina team. That was kind of the first thing I thought. I was like, with Pittsburgh, he was clearly like, apex handler. Like he was the guy they were running a lot. They just threw him a lot. But in Carolina, is that really where he's going to slot in? I do kind of wonder how he'll be used. So I think I'll be keeping my eye on that. I wouldn't expect him to have the load in Carolina that he did in Pittsburgh, given the throwing talent that they have there. So how does he slot in? I don't know, but he's a good player. So like when you have a good player, you figure out a way to get them on the field and to help them be effective. Some other things we haven't touched on. Greg Cousins with Minnesota is a big signing. This is a guy who scored more than 60 goals in a season in 2017 maybe. He as Brandon Mattis pointed out, he has played in like something like 60 less games than Mattis, but has more scores than him. some silly statistic. I guess that's what happens when you spend your life on the D line. There was a couple other ones that I was. Steve Migilski going out to Seattle. I mean, that's one we haven't talked about yet. He's been kind of a mainstay in Pittsburgh.
He led the team last year in blocks. He's almost my age.
Big body, like great in the air. He has a lot of experience. I think you talked about Seattle kind of lacking that explosiveness on defense to get turns sometimes, and like adding Ambrose was obviously huge for that. But adding a guy like Migilski too, like he doesn't have the speed and athleticism of a Lucas Ambrose, but he has something that Ambrose is never going to have, which is height. Like he's, you can't coach it, you can't teach it, you have it or you don't. And all the experience. I mean, he's played. I'd venture to guess he's probably got to be like somewhere near the top in points played. I feel like he's been around forever, and he seems to play every game every year. So I think those are some impactful signings.
Wait. Before you move on, shout out Matt Weiss and his nickname for Mogilski, which is the corn-fed mule. Needs to carry on into the Northwest. That is a very Steel Town nickname given to him, and I think it needs to make its way up into the Pacific Corridor. Like, needs to be on there.
Yeah. Yeah, because do they even know what corn is up there?
By the
Okay,
way,
Randy
if
Paus.
Mogilski plays in all 12 games this year, he will reach 100 for his career. So even if you're
Okay,
listening, I think that's a very healthy goal for you this year.
there you go. Rami Paus, who started in Madison, went up to Minnesota, and now going to DC. So, like, we've talked about a lot of their losses. Rami Paus, very good player, versatile. You can play him on O, you can play him on D. I would imagine they play him on the D line. He's a good person to kind of run the counterattack through after a turnover. Got the throws. I know they don't huck a lot over there, but he's a guy who can do it for you. And then something I want to pick your mind on. I saw a name on the Philadelphia roster that I haven't seen in a while, and I don't really know what
It's
to
not
make of
delivery. It's Tyler DiGirolamo.
it. That's
Yeah,
the
he's
one.
been
I
on
mean,
Philly's roster each of the last 2 years.
I
I'm
thought.
probably right at the front of the DiGirolamo bandwagon, fan wagon, whatever you want to call it. Like his 2015-2016 run with the Thunderbirds is probably like the two greatest overall offensive seasons in terms of just
Pretty
talent and
insane.
whatever. But yeah, the DiGirolamo on Philly thing. He hasn't played for them yet. I've heard things
No.
that he won't really be involved unless he's kind of fully committed, which makes total sense to me. A player of his caliber, like either you're in or you're out. It's binary at that point. You can't just come in and
Yeah.
kind of fill a role. That's not how he's ever really played this sport. So I don't really know what to tell you. I mean, clearly you know that name. Anyone who has followed this sport back to when Pitt was winning back-to-back titles in 2012 and 2013 probably knows the name DiGirolamo, was a star on the Next Gen Tour, went to double wide, and then, of course, had like 3 straight years of debilitating knee and leg injuries that just sort of derailed his career. And here we are now, many years later, just sort of with questions. But I mean, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if they can figure out a way to sort of put him in a Colicchio like role where he doesn't have to do a ton, but can go provide size and some throwing and a different dimension that they maybe don't have from their 6'7" O line players elsewhere. Like, of course, I'm intrigued by seeing DiGirolamo, but you know, we'll see on that one.
Yeah, I was interested because I know I had seen his name pop up before, but I saw him and it was like on the roster. Like I feel like before I've seen his name associated with
Yeah.
Philadelphia, but I didn't know if I had
Look,
actually ever seen him
is Alex
rostered.
Thorne on that roster? Then somewhere in the periphery, there is a DiGirolamo in the shadows waiting.
That
Yeah.
must be it. That
Yeah.
must be it. So we've kind of hit on. I feel like most things. I think one name we haven't mentioned is Shane Worthington returning to Seattle after not
Well,
playing last year.
you mentioned McGilsky and Ambrose and their ability to generate blocks. I mean, Worthington had 60 play. He was averaging almost a block and a half a game in his first 50 starts
Yeah.
with Seattle over 4+ seasons. Like he kind of got lost in the shuffle of Austin last year. Didn't even start in their playoff game, and so I really think he's going to come back amped up. And he was a part of Seattle's identity in a way that only like 6 to 7 players have been over the last several seasons, where even though the defense wasn't some kind of elite unit, you could kind of rely on Worthington making a play or 3 in any given game and giving his matchup some guff. And I think, again, now that they have Ambrose and a McGilsky and a Christian Foster and now Worthington, now all able to amplify the already existing Spencer Lofink and whoever else is going to be heading up that Cascades D-line, like, we've talked about before, the way in which the sport works in individual matchups, when you can kind of skew down a notch or two and not have somebody take someone outside of their comfort zone, it just makes so much of a difference. And I just see that right now at the Scades, where it's like, ooh, things are starting to line up a little bit here. Things are starting to fall into place. Yeah, Worthington is another one of those pieces where it's nice. Ian Sweeney, too. We haven't even talked about him. Led Portland last year in
Mm-hmm.
assists. Big lefty thrower, absolute infinite
Yep.
range from forehand or backhand side, has a half field hammer. I again, like, if they can maybe use him on offense, loosen up and allow Leaf or Garrett Martin to, as he comes back from injury, Martin that is, to play both ways, play some D-line and some O. Like, I don't know. Seattle's got options. They're fun. But anyways, let's get away from some of the more interesting things. I wanted to get back for a second to what we were talking about a little bit with New York and DC. And I think there's a couple other teams who qualify in this too. Good teams, like still championship level teams who I think we're having more questions about than we had at the end of the 2023 season. Obviously, DC without having Boxley and Fall and Ja and Holland. New York without having signed Katz and Babbitt. But I think in addition to that, and I'll add them in here too, Los Angeles losing a couple of those really important, I think especially on defense, matchup pieces, Jason Valley, Kevin Tien, Marcel Osborne on offense won't be returning. He was their 5th leading scorer last year. You know, not necessarily the headline stars, but I think very important players for what the Aviators were to accomplish last year, making it to the West Division finale. And then the last team would be Minnesota Windchill, who I think have added some really nice pieces. You talk about them re-adding Greg Cousins, Matt Rader, but they lose Abe Coffin. We talked about that in the last episode, and he was so important to wherever they put him in. It felt like wherever they played Abe, he was going to be successful. They don't have him this season. He was a big part of, I think, their confidence boost in that semifinals performance last year. What do you think about these 4 teams who I think we still very much put in a position of making the playoffs, but maybe with more uncertainty than we would have had in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start with Minnesota since I'm obviously the most familiar with them. But Abe Coffin, like that loss, like they've added some talent for sure. Like Greg Cousins is a great player. Matt Rader, I mean, he's a guy who you talk about size and speed and athleticism. I mean, doesn't get much better than him. I was actually going through the 2016 semifinal against Madison the other day, and he had a couple of plays in there I had forgotten about. But man, you just watch him out there, and you just kind of wonder how he does it.
I always think, did you see the play where he just absolutely takes Kevin Pettit-Scantling to the track meet on one of his cuts? He just hits him with like a little baby bait under and then takes off on like a 4-4 40-yard sprint into the end zone and just catches it running away from everyone. Like,
if he gets a step on you, then it's about to be 4 or 5 steps pretty quick. So they add talent. Like that's like, I think not really up for debate, but is it what they need?
Yeah.
You know, the pieces they've been adding haven't been an Abe Coffin, right? And you can't really replace him. So that's a big question mark. Their offense was a little inconsistent last year. They did find their footing, I thought, enough in the playoffs to be effective, but still like very clearly a team that relies on its defense. Now you take Abe Coffin out of the equation. Like, can their offense maintain at least what they had last year? Because really you would have liked to see them take the next step forward this year. I don't know if that happens without Abe Coffin in the lineup. We did talk about Tristan Van de Mortel, probably going to be slotting in there. Good player. Doesn't have the like game-changing ability from a throwing perspective that an Abe Coffin does. I think Abe Coffin's also a sneaky good defender. He's not a big guy.
Sneaky good. He made 2022
but he's
defense.
A good defender. Exactly. And Tristan Van de Mortel like doesn't quite have like that same defensive ability either. He's not someone that you're thinking is going to generate the pressure or the D's that Abe Coffin might generate. So, you know, they might end up we could look back on this months from now and feel really silly saying we're worried about them. But I think it's a legitimate question when you have a struggling offense and then you take a guy who seems to never struggle off of it. So.
And then LA, I'll kind of speak to them. You know, obviously last year with the signings of Pablo Giannis and Sean McDougal, not to mention bringing aboard Daniel Brunker and a whole host of other really revitalizing pieces that made LA a playoff team once again, they feel like they're still very much going to be in the thick of the playoff race, if not in another West Division championship game in 2024, if all things go according to plan. But some of those, I think, back-end stabilizing pieces are going to be a little bit different this year. They've re-added again some of their veterans. Pre-pandemic, Aviator players in Brian Nguyen and Brent George, two great goal scorers back in their heyday, but a bit past their prime. So I'm interested to see what kind of shape they end up being in 2024. Obviously, if they come in with a whole bunch of motivation, they can be big impact players, but we just haven't seen them in a few years. And then there's a lot of rookies on the back end of this LA team. And with that always comes, I think, a lot of, potential. Obviously, last year they added in the rookie of the year and Lucas Ambrose, who we didn't have a whole bunch of knowledge on going into the year. That could happen again for LA, or it could be a mixed bag. It just felt like with the 2023 Aviators, everything that they kind of pulled in that was new hit. You talk about Pavel and McDougal, first team all UFA, hit. Brunker coming in, being that kind of utility piece where they can put him on offense if they're missing there. Okay, doesn't work there. Let's shift him over the defense. Hit. You get Valley, Tien, these other pieces. Hit. This year, they're not quite bringing in that. They're coming back with a little bit more stability. They're bringing back a lot of the same core. And as we've talked a bunch in this episode, that does stand to benefit them. But in the West, they still feel like have a rung or two to go to get to the top. And so where is that improvement going to come from? How are they going to kind of continue to elevate? And, my biggest question is, did they maybe shoot too far past their expectations last year and sort of now land in this weird ground where they're supposed to compete for a divisional title, maybe still a year before they're ready? I remember going into 2023 and talking extensively with Daniel Cohen about, whoa, look at these Pavlianos and Sean McDougal signings, but hold the phone, still really good West, still have to overcome some teams, and they just blew past all of that. Due to some luck, they needed San Diego to beat Oakland in the final weekend of the regular season to even make the postseason, but I digress. This is an LA team that found a lot of marginal success last year. Can they keep that up this year?
Yeah, and I think, kind of like you said, everyone else in the West that was either in the playoffs or competing for the playoffs feels like they're going to be as good or better. And either, we talked about Salt Lake, they didn't really add anyone, but I do think that having those same players come back another year could be improved this year. And then you looked at Oakland's lost Mac Heck, but it seems like they're adding a slew of players
young.
That could improve
that might still be
so young, yes.
One of the three youngest teams in the league. Their arrow just seems to be pointing up and up and up.
And the Cascades seem like they're primed to maybe make a playoff push this year too. And then you have LA, who was building and seemed to be getting better, especially at the end of the year. They knocked off Colorado, which I think, if we're being honest here, I don't think any of us would have picked that going into that matchup. Not that it was impossible, but we all knew what Colorado's ceiling was and where we thought that they might end up. And it's crazy that, like you said, they kind of shot past maybe where we thought they would be in year one. And now it almost looks like abort the mission. Now it looks like they might just be going right back to where they were 2 years ago. So I don't know. They still have some pieces I like. Like we talk about Pavel, obviously a great player. Brandon Van Dusen we've talked about. They still have the Sultan out there still doing it. Michael Keough. I do love Sean McDougal. They still have some pieces. I think this isn't like they're going to go from a playoff team to a non-competitive team. I don't think that at all. But I mean, like you mentioned, the departures, they didn't really seem to bring in, at least to what we know, anyone who's going to be able to fill those slots. So I'm nervous for LA this year.
Well,
I'm nervous for what year two of the Pavel era looks like.
And here's what's really tough is that their first two games, first game opening weekend at Oakland, which is just a tough place to play. I mean, ask Colorado, ask Salt Lake. Salt Lake got out of there by the skin of their teeth last year. They had to play tough. It's windy. Their fans show up. The Spiders play intensely and just make a lot of highlight plays at home. That's a tough way to start your season, especially given that Oakland will have the motivation of LA basically knocking them out last year. And then the second game for LA, their home opener, is against Salt Lake. So 0-2 is a definitive possibility for LA. And granted, they started 1-3 last year and made the playoffs, but it's not easy digging out of these loss holes early in the season, especially in a West that figures to be improved over last year.
100%. So we've seen the rosters. We've talked about the rosters. We've talked about, I think, about all we can talk about now. So on paper right now, no analysis. Who's your championship weekend?
Vibes-based economy. All right. No analysis. In the East, I'll go second straight year DC. I just need to see something else other than New York for the fifth or sixth straight year. Fifth, 2018, 2019, 2020. 5 straight East Division championships for New York. So yeah, I'd like to see that dynasty broken up. In the Central, I've got Minnesota repeating. In the South, I've got Carolina back on top. And in the West, I've got Salt Lake, although I think it's kind of a toss-up with Colorado. I think those two teams are going to go right at it again. I mean, we forget last year, Salt Lake won both of those games by a single goal. This is still one of the best rivalries in the entire league. It's 3-2 Colorado holding their series edge over the past 2 years. Seeing if they can improve on that, seeing if Salt Lake can get back. But yeah, so DC, Minnesota, Carolina, Salt Lake. Those are my 4 right now. Well, I might change it before we make like official preseason picks, but that's my roster revelation championship weekend selection.
Do you think Colorado lost to LA intentionally so they could keep the series advantage on Salt Lake because they knew they were going to lose that game? Was that like a big brain play by them? Were they like, no, we might, I think we'll lose this next week. Let's lose now
Cam,
so that we can still have bragging rights in the series.
Cam, if I ever told you that you intentionally lost a game to avoid playing someone else, you would probably come after me with a weapon. Like, I just don't. No, there's too many competitors.
I would cartoon reach my way through my webcam out of yours somehow. Yes, that would happen. Okay, so the reason I looked so shocked is because we are picking 4 completely different teams.
That's awesome. You aren't Daniel. See, if it was Daniel, we would have blind done this, and we would have ended up picking the exact 4 teams.
No. All right. Like, as you went through, I was like, oh my gosh, we're not going to pick any of the same teams. Okay, let's start in the Central. Like, I play in the Central. Clearly, I got to take us. Like, I'm confident in our roster. I respect Minnesota as much as anyone. Like, I do believe they're a great team. No analysis, sorry. But, I got to take us, right? Like, we've been improving. I got to take us. I don't think I'd be let back into a practice if I was like, oh, yeah, Minnesota's going to win our division. East, I'm taking New York. Regardless of if they resign, taking New York. South, I think Atlanta breaks through this year. I think Atlanta is going to be our lone team this year at championship weekend that is there for the first time. And out of all the teams we feel like are in contention, they're still the only one who hasn't been there. And I think this is the year they break through. And out West, I've said it multiple times already over the past couple episodes, I'm taking Colorado. So that gives me Colorado, Indy, New York, and Atlanta. And I'll go one step further. We're going to see New York as not the top overall seed. I will throw that out there too. I do believe the top overall seed will not be New York Empire, given what we know right now.
All right, I can already feel the response from the Austin Soul coming. Like, we have not spent any time talking about a semifinalist from last year. Another one of those teams who we could absolutely put in the category of didn't really add anyone, but retained 90% of a roster that, again, won the South Division.
100%.
That might have been the toughest playoff format of any of the 4 divisions. I mean, all 3 of those teams in the South, Austin, Carolina, and Atlanta, feel like very, very good championship weekend contenders should either of the 3 make it. So I just got to say that. We'll definitely talk a lot more about the Soul going forward as we stretch closer and closer to opening poll again on April 26th. But that will do it for this episode of Swing Pass Here and Now. We will be back next week with even more preseason coverage and hopefully more signing news and roster information for you. Again, you should go to watchufa.com, check out all the rosters, read the coverage, get really into it, and get excited. We are so close now to the start of the season where things really kick off and really get us going. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.